All right. So we're going to talk about 1.6 design of experiments. I don't know about you, but on Monday we're going to start using the computers in here finally. And you guys can, I'll still talk a lot, but it'll be less vocabulary. So I'll be excited about that. I don't know about you. All right. So an experiment, we talked a little bit about an experiment last time, but it is a controlled study to determine the effect of varying one or more explanatory variables or factors. Okay, variables, factors, those are basically the same thing. Has on a response variable. One of the interesting things about this particular section, we're going to use different words to say the same things we did before. I mean, there'll be some new stuff too, but so factors, variables, those are basically the same thing. Any combination of factors is called a treatment. Okay? All right. So, one of the interesting things I think about statistics is there were different sciences that did statistics. It's a kind of a relatively new field, especially in mathematics. And so a lot of different disciplines use different words to describe the same thing. So in the past, we've talked about individuals. In this section, it's called an experimental unit, which we will never use again in this class. Or we could use subjects. They're all the same thing, okay? Just an object defined by data, okay? So we'll also talk about a control group, okay? The control group serves as a baseline to compare other treatments. Okay. We'll also talk about blinding. Okay, which is non-disclosure of a treatment. Okay. So we've got two types of blinding: single blind, which means the patient doesn't know if they are receiving the placebo or the treatment. Okay, I'm getting low on the board, aren't I? This looks fine on the video, but I guess I'll go higher. Or we also have double blind, which means that both the patient and the doctor don't know. Now, why do you think it would be a good idea for the doctor not to know if you're getting the treatment? Somebody has to know, but we don't want the doctor to know. Why would that be a good idea?
Their behavior could affect the experiment.
Yeah, they could have some built-in biases that would affect the experiment, okay? So, so if we double blind the study so that both the patient and the doctor don't know, then everybody's a little bit more objective, hopefully. Okay. So you may read something like this. We'll make sure you guys haven't forgotten certain things. You may read something like a placebo-controlled double-blind study of, to see if Lipitor prevents, and I'm going to abbreviate this, cardiovascular disease. Okay. So 2838 subjects participated. Age 40 to 75 with type 2 diabetes and no history of cardiovascular disease. Okay. Subjects took either 10 milligrams Lipitor or placebo daily. 10 milligrams, and there was 1,479, and the placebo, there was 1,411. The response variable was a cardiovascular event. Heart attack, stroke, something like that. Okay? So the first question I want to ask, what was the population? And, oh, that's not going to help me. I would like to pick on, is Cheyenne here? I don't think Cheyenne's here. How about Sarah Stratton? Yeah. Sarah, what do you think the population is?
2838 subjects.
2838 subjects? That's the population?
Or would it be for people with type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, that would be the sample. Your sample is the 2838. In the study, the population is what?
All of the people with type 2 diabetes.
All people. It's actually a little more narrow than what you said.
With no history.
I can't hear you.
With no history of type 2 diabetes.
No history of cardiovascular disease and
Type 2 diabetes.
type 2 and 40 to 75, right? Okay. All right. So that's the population. All right. We got the sample there. All right. So let me ask another question. Why do you guys think that the placebo group and the Lipitor group were different sizes? Do they have any ideas?
A result of doing, like, picking each of them randomly, like we did on the chart, you end up with a different number.
That could happen. Generally, you'd like them to be close to the same size, and they're pretty close to the same size. But
So trying to make sure that the that two sample populations are homogeneous.
well, that's what the randomization is doing. It's trying to make them homogeneous.
Did they lose some people along the way? Did they
Lose some
drop out?
people. Why would they lose people?
Maybe they
You're on the right track, actually.
dropped out of the.
Dropped out because,
Develops heart disease.
well, if they developed heart disease, that's something we'd want to keep them in for.
They need the Lipitor, like for their health condition.
Well, we don't know. It's an experimental drug, let's say. So generally what happens, this is real life. Tell me your name. Sydney was on the right track here. Usually the placebo group's almost always going to be smaller than the treatment group. Because what happens is people are like, I don't know if I'm getting placebo, but this isn't doing me any good. I'm just going to quit taking it. And so you'll get more people that drop out of the placebo group than the treatment group. So that's actually pretty common. So it's one of those things we have to deal with, and it sucks, but it's life. Yes?
And you probably say the original sample size of like 3,000 people were dropping out, or is that the sample size for people dropping out?
Well, if you add these two together, it adds up to 2838. So they probably had more than that, but yeah, it was probably 1,500 each, and probably had people in both drop out. Yes.
Those two don't add up to 2838.
Oh, they don't?
No,
What does that add up to?
2890.
Oh, I got a typo in there. Anyway. I'll have to fix that. I didn't notice that. That's funny. Okay, so there's a typo in there, but anyway, it's close enough. The point is, more people drop out of the placebo group. It's just something we have to deal with. All right, so let's talk about steps to design an experiment. Okay? So number one, you have to identify the problem, and you need to be explicit. Okay? So this was a true story. When I was up at the University of Utah, a doctor came to me and she said, I want to design an experiment so that I find out if people, so she was a dermatologist, so she was tracking skin cancer. She says, I just want to know if people improve their habits in avoiding skin cancer. And I said, well, that's a very good question. How do I measure that? So I'm going to throw that out to you. That's exactly what she said to me. I want to see if people improve with their habits on relation to skin cancer. How do you measure that? True story.
If you could ask them how much time they spend in the sun and whether or not they use sunblock, that's only going to cover one thing.
Okay, so ask how much time they spend in the sun and whether they use sunblock. Yeah, that would be something, but like you said, that's only one thing. Consider genetic component.
It's different skin color.
Now she's talking about like genetics, so now we're going to have to make an expensive test here, right? Okay, so she just added the money to that experiment. Okay. Yeah, so this can be a big problem, is just identifying the problem, being very explicit. So you know what she came up with? She said, well, here's what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach a class. I'm going to give everybody a pre-test about skin cancer before I say anything. Then I'm going to take the papers in. I will teach the class, and then I will give them the exact same test. And I will ask them, you know, do you wear a hat? Do you wear long sleeves? All that stuff. Okay? Now, the question is, do you think that's a good... It's certainly something you can do. Comment?
Well, the biggest problem with that is that you're only studying college culture.
You're only studying the college culture. Yeah, I don't know if it was a college class, but yeah.
Like a specific class.
Yeah, so what you're studying is, can people get the right answer on the test, right? But what you don't know is, are people actually wearing hats? Are they actually wearing long sleeves? Or are they just getting the right answer? Okay? So there's a question about how reliable that is. But it was better than what she kind of was a deer in the headlights when I was like, so how do you measure that? That's what she came up with. So there are different ways. Now, with regards to the survey, what's the problem with the survey? Asking, do you use sunscreen?
Response size.
You're going to have response bias. People are either going to forget or they're going to lie, right? Or maybe they'll tell the truth, but you don't know. People are probably going to be like, oh, skin cancer. Oh, yeah, I always wear sunscreen. Okay?
Doesn't that kind of approach require following up, like much later on in their lives?
Yeah.
Cohort study.
But hers was a lot cheaper than doing the genetic study, though. I will say that. Okay? Okay?
But most young people in college class don't have skin cancer.
Yeah. Yet.
You have to follow up with them much
Can
later.
I tell you a funny story? So back when I was single, my friend went out with this girl, and she had to go. She had skin cancer apparently, and so she had to get her head examined or whatever. It was on her head, I remember. For some reason, he thought it was brain tumor, and so he told me about it. And so then I ended up going out with the same girl like months later or something. And I was like, and then I told Andy, and he said, "Oh, you should ask her about that brain tumor." And I was like, "Oh, so how is that brain tumor?" She goes, "Brain tumor? You mean skin cancer?" Anyway, so be explicit. Don't, otherwise people will guess wrong. It's a funny thing. All right, so the next step is determine the factors or the variables that affect the response variable. Okay. Number 3, determine the sample size. In the book, they call it experimental units. I will never talk about experimental units after this section. It will always be sample size. Okay. Number 4, determine the level for each factor, although I'm probably going to call it variable from here on out. And you're going to control and you're going to randomize. And then step number 5, you will conduct the experiment. Once again, you will randomly assign 2 groups. And you will collect and process the data. Finally, number 6, you will test the claim. And that will generally either be through a confidence interval or a hypothesis test. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to say is, are the results generalizable? Generalizable. Can they apply to the population? So let me tell you about an experiment that was done back in the 80s, okay? You can see my wonderful industry here. This is the back of a car. Those are the tires. That's the top of the car, right? So when you're looking at the back of a car, usually they have some sort of brake lights here, right? So back in the 1980s, they were concerned about rear-end collisions. And somebody said, you know what? Especially at night, those are your running lights on. Somebody said, well, what would be a good idea? What if we put a 3rd brake light here and we didn't light it until somebody actually hit the brake? And then maybe that'll help people avoid rear-end collisions. Okay? So they did this experiment, and in the experiment, adding this 3rd brake light, people were like, whoa, that thing's blinding me, I better stop. Okay? And so they cut down on rear-end collisions by like 80%. It was a lot. Very, very big number. So they were like, this is a good idea. Let's send it to Congress. Congress says, you've convinced us. We are now going to require car manufacturers to add this 3rd brake light here. Okay? And so I remember, I do remember when those came out, I was like, ooh, well, that's kind of interesting. But the funny thing is that in real life, In the experiment, this was kind of a novelty. People were like, oh, I'm not used to seeing that. But after a while, everybody's like, I don't care. I'm just going to hit them anyway, right? Okay. So it only cut car accidents by like 10%, whereas in the experiment, it was 80%. So the results really weren't generalizable to the public, okay? Because the novelty wore off. People got used to it, okay? And so that can be one of the big problems with experiments. Especially, I will tell you this. Yesterday we talked about 538.com, really great website. Another great statistics podcast is Freakonomics, one of my favorites. Okay, a lot of times they talk about experiments. They did a thing on why experiments don't work in real life, and one of the problems with experiments, especially with drug companies, number one, the drug company has a big incentive to make that thing work. Number two, so they pick people with whom it will probably work the best. And in the clinical trial, you know, the nurse is going to remind you to take your pain pill every 4 hours or whatever it is. And so they're taking it as directed. In real life, people forget. And the drugs never work as good as they did in the original experiment because they kind of engineer it that way because they're trying to get approval, okay? So I know experiments are generally better accepted than observational studies, but there can be problems with experiments as well in the fact that they're artificial. They're not real life. So let's talk about some experimental designs. So number one, we'll talk about a completely randomized design. Okay? So each subject is randomly assigned to a group. Okay? So let's kind of go through the steps to design an experiment, and we'll draw a little diagram as we go here. So number one says identify the problem. Okay? That we just talked about over there. So let's say that a farmer wants to know if fertilizer helps his plants grow. Okay? So we've identified a problem. Okay? So step two says determine the factors that would affect that. So let me open it up to you. What do you think are some variables that would affect plant growth?
Weather.
Weather. Be more specific about weather.
If it's too hot or too much rain.
So temperature. Okay. So temperature would be, what else? Yes? Bugs. Okay, what else?
Soil quality.
Soil quality. Okay, how do you measure that? That's going to be my thing.
Nitrogen content.
Well, nitrogen's what's in fertilizer, right? So we should include what? What are we testing? Fertilizer, that would be a good one to include, right? Fertilizer. I'll leave soil quality there. I don't know how to measure that, but
Acidity as well.
acidity. You guys are forgetting a couple of big ones here. Water. Okay.
Type of crop.
What'd you say?
Type of crop.
We'll pick the type of crop. How's you gonna pick? One more really important thing that helps plants grow.
Sunlight.
Sunlight. Okay. All right. So now, can we control these things? Okay. If we put it in the greenhouse, we could control the temperature. We could keep the bugs out. We could put them all in the same soil, right? So they would all have that. The acidity would probably be the same. We could water them the same. We could control the sunlight. The only thing that we would want to modify would be the fertilizer, right? Then we could know if the fertilizer was what was helping, because we're going to control all the other factors. Okay, and put it in the greenhouse. Does that make sense? Okay, so this would really help us to know if fertilizer helps. Okay, all right. Step 3 says determine the sample size. Okay, so the farmer says, okay, I'm going to donate 60 plants to this project. Okay, 60 seeds or whatever. All right, so step number 4 says determine the level. Determine the level. And so here's what we could do. Okay, the only thing we really want to vary, so we're going to try to keep everything the same, but we're going to try to vary the level of the fertilizer. Okay, so the idea here is maybe we could have no fertilizer. We could have 2 teaspoons of fertilizer, or we could have 4 teaspoons of fertilizer. Everything else we're going to hold the same. Okay. All right, so now step 5, we're going to conduct the experiment. Okay, so this was a diagram for what we could do. So since it's a completely randomized design here, what we're going to do, the first thing that we're going to do, this is what a lot of people forget on their test, is we're going to randomize. Okay, and since we've got 3 treatments, we'll randomize to A, B, and C. Okay, so in group A, we'll have 20 plants. Group B will have 20 plants. Group C will have 20 plants. Okay, and then we're going to initiate our treatment. This one's going to have no fertilizer. This one's going to have 2 teaspoons of fertilizer. This one's going to have 4 teaspoons of fertilizer. Okay, we'll grow them, and then at the end, we will compare the results. Okay, so this would be a nice diagram for a completely randomized design. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. All right, so another type of design would be something that we would call a matched pairs design. Okay. And you're going to, so one example, a couple different examples, is you could match people based on, twin studies. Those are some of the funnest ones to do. Do a twin study. Or you could do husband and wife. Okay, that would be a natural pair. You could do the left side of your body versus your right. Or you could match on other characteristics. Okay? Now, one of my favorite episodes for Freakonomics was a study, it was in Somerville, Massachusetts. There was a priest, and he was concerned about juvenile delinquents. So he came up with this great idea, and he said, you know what, I want to stop juvenile delinquency when they get out of the reform school or whatever. We're going to, I think that counseling would help these kids stay out of jail, these boys. Okay? So what he did was he did a matched pair. Okay? So first of all, what he did was he matched based on age and economic status. I think that's what it did. And they were all boys, little boys. Okay? So, you could match on twins, husband and wife, whatever. This is what he decided to do, was he was going to match on age. And then what he did was he said, okay, we're going to randomly assign to the treatment. Okay? And the treatment was a counselor or no counselor. Okay? Kind of like a big brother. So they get out of jail, they have this guy, an adult, that was a good role model. And so then they administer treatment. Okay. And then the final step would be to compute the difference for each pair. Okay. Now, would you think this was a good idea? The interesting thing, you should really go, maybe I should see if I can post that. You should really listen to that. One of the things that they found was the boys who had a counselor ended up going back to jail more often than the boys who had no counselor. Despite the fact that these boys had wonderful memories of these counselors and said they changed their lives, apparently it was worse. So after a while, they were like, we're ending this study. It's not helping. In fact, it's making it worse. So that can be the interesting thing, is sometimes you can get some really surprising results from your experiment. Another type of experiment we can do is called the randomized block design. Okay. So once again, as we look at this, with the completely randomized design, you randomize right off the bat. With the matched pairs design, randomization is actually the second step, not the first. You're going to actually match them based on some sort of a, some sort of a reason to match them together. Okay, age and economic status or whatever. With the completely randomized design, you have what we call a blocking variable. Okay, which means that you separate before your randomization. Okay. Now, one of the things, I believe this was another Freakonomics episode. One of the things that they found is men and women react very differently to medications. Okay. And so a lot of times, in a lot of studies, as I mentioned earlier, they're concerned about, say, birth defects. There was a study done, I want to say the 60s, maybe it was the 70s, on an anti-nausea medication. I don't remember what it was called. But anyway, they would give it to women that were experiencing morning sickness with pregnancy. One of the awful things that they found was that it caused serious birth defects. So as a result of that, one of the things that a lot of drug companies would do, they would say, okay, we don't want any pregnant women in our study because we don't want to cause them problems. Well, pregnant women need drugs probably as much as more as anybody else, right? So how do you do that? So there's a lot of drugs that have not been tested on women now. And so it can be one of those tough things. Yes, we don't want birth defects, but we need to know if these drugs are safe, especially for pregnant women. Okay? And so one of the ways that we can do that is with a randomized block design. So a lot of times what will happen is we'll break up into men and women, let's say. Okay? And then, so gender in this case is your blocking variable. Okay? And so then at this point, now we will randomize. So randomization, once again, is the second step. Okay? And so it's going to look a lot like the completely randomized, but just remember that you've got this blocking variable first. So this is not random. Okay? The randomization is going to be second. So you'll have two treatments, A and B. You'll run the experiment, and then you will compare the results. Okay? And you'll do the same thing with the women. A and B, you'll run the treatment, and then you will compare. Okay? So it's appropriate to compare the women versus the women and the men versus the men, but it's not appropriate to compare the men versus the women because the original assignment is not random. But there are reasons to do that, and especially, birth defects would be a pretty important one. They will do this as well in like advertising. Men and women react differently to advertising. Just to give a good stereotype, men like the fart jokes, they don't like the romance. Women like the romance, they don't like the fart jokes or whatever. So, so that can be another type of experimental design. So that's the randomized block design, where you have some sort of a blocking variable such as gender. That can be a common one, but you could do it on any variable that you would want to. So, I think that's it. Okay. So, do you guys have any questions for me? Okay. Yes.
So, I think I'm remembering it right, but is like the block design similar to a cluster? Don't you kind of block them out and separate?
No, not really. It's the question for the video was, is a randomized block design similar to a cluster? I'm going to say no. Your cluster sample is going to be for an observational study. Your randomized block design is going to be for an experiment. So that's kind of the main difference. But yeah, they're pretty different there. So, any other questions? It will be important to distinguish between observational studies and experiments. So, all right. So Monday we will go over our quiz. Will be on 1.6. Monday will be an exciting day because we're going to start getting into the computers and graphing, and we'll actually start doing some math. It'll actually start being a math class instead of a vocabulary class. So, all right. But anyway, so see y'all on Monday.